Imagine walking into uh, the massive climate-controlled server room of some global tech company.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. And you are surrounded by miles of fiber optic cables, thousands of blinking lights, humming mainframes, just this system that is so overwhelmingly complex, it takes a whole team of highly specialized engineers just to understand the basic instruction manual.
Oh, yeah, a true monument to human intellect and layered architecture.
Exactly. But then, right in the middle of all this delicate high-tech machinery, you notice a guy in faded overalls holding a broom.
Just a janitor.
Yeah, just a guy with a broom. And you come to find out that somehow this guy who doesn't even know how to turn on a monitor is actually the single reason the entire building hasn't burned to the ground.
Wow. Okay, that is quite the image.
Yeah.
And it really perfectly captures the absolute paradox we are unpacking for you today.
Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. You, the listener, sent us a truly fascinating stack of material to explore today. We've got everything from historical overviews and homily transcripts from the Capuchin Franciscans and the Felician village.
Some really rich sources in there.
Yeah, and an extensive excerpt from the Catholic Encyclopedia diving into the towering intellects of early Christianity. Oh, and hilariously, a link to a modern Italian sanctuary website for San Felice all'Acqua that was actually blocked by a Cloudflare security firewall when we tried to open it.
Which is just perfectly ironic considering the topic.
It really is. But our mission today is to sift through all of this to understand one specific astonishing life. We're looking at how a 16th century Italian farmhand, a man who cheerfully referred to himself as a donkey.
A literal donkey, yes.
Right, how he managed to achieve the exact same level of it during historical reverence as the greatest intellectual giants of his era.
And, to understand how that happens, we really have to look at the mechanics of his life. Because starting out, Felix of Cantalice was not, he wasn't some spiritual prodigy. He was a late bloomer.
Very late.
Yeah, born in 1515 to a family of poor farmers. And for a very long time, that is exactly what he remained. He worked as a shepherd and a farm laborer well into his late 20s.
Up until he was 28, right?
Yeah.
Which means he was fully entrenched in the grueling day-to-day grind of agrarian survival. Like, this isn't a story of a teenager running off to find himself in a monastery.
Right.
He was a grown man carrying the physical toll of a hard life.
Precisely. The historical accounts emphasize that the physical labor was relentless, but there was this deep internal tension brewing within him. He had a profound habit of entering deep contemplative prayer while he was literally working in the fields.
Which honestly must have been hard to hide.
Oh, definitely. The local lore even produced these legends claiming that angels would come down and take over his plow so he could slip away to attend morning mass.
I love that legend because it really highlights the friction he was feeling. He clearly felt a pull towards something else. I mean, the records you sent suggest he even considered heading into the wilderness to become a hermit.
He did.
But he kept putting it off. He was essentially like procrastinating his own life's calling. He is like a modern-day reluctant hero who knows what he needs to do but just refuses to cross the threshold,
And it took a traumatic physical catalyst to finally push him over that threshold, because in the autumn of 1543, he was out plowing a field when the team of oxen pulling his heavy wooden plow suddenly panicked.
Oh, well.
Yeah, they stampeded, and Felix was dragged down and trampled, the plow dragged directly over his body.
Which, given the medical realities of the 16th century, an accident involving heavy farm equipment and stampeding livestock is usually a death sentence. Or at best, you were permanently maimed.
Yet he stood up without a single scratch.
None.
None. His clothes were torn to shreds, but his body was completely unbroken.
And that literal brush with death shatters his procrastination. Like, that is the literal wake-up call, because he has this sudden, intense realization that he was sparing himself for nothing.
Exactly. He actually wrote later that he felt he ought to have died and gone to hell for refusing his calling. So the hesitation vanishes, he finally acts, and he joins the Capuchin friars.
Which, while great for him, introduces a massive logistical problem for the religious order.
Oh, a huge problem.
Right, because Felix has finally arrived, but he is completely uneducated. He is illiterate, he cannot read scripture, he cannot be ordained as a priest, and he certainly cannot debate theology from a pulpit.
Right. They can't exactly assign him to the archives or the library to copy manuscripts.
No. So what does a 16th century religious order do with an illiterate farmhand? They assign him to the streets.
Yes. In 1547, the Capuchins send him to Rome to serve as a questor.
Let's break down that role for the listener because questor sounds like a fantasy novel title, honestly.
It does sound epic.
But the reality was incredibly grueling.
Right. A questor was essentially the designated beggar for a mendicant order. These friars lived entirely on the charity of the public. They didn't have endowments or, massive estates generating income.
They relied on donations for their next meal.
Exactly. So the questor acted as the vital economic and social bridge between the cloistered life of the friary and the harsh secular reality of the city. It required a really unique psychological resilience because this person was constantly exposed to the chaos, the wealth, the desperation, and honestly the mockery of the Roman streets.
And Felix took on this role for 40 years. 4 decades walking the cobblestones of Rome.
It's hard to even fathom that kind of endurance.
Totally, and he did it completely barefoot, carrying this massive sack over his shoulder. He would walk through the blistering heat of the Roman summer and the freezing, muddy rains of winter, knocking on doors to beg for bread, and then later hauling heavy flasks of wine and oil.
The physical destruction this caused to his body was immense. The accounts describe him developing deep, agonizing gashes on the soles of his feet.
And his response to that pain is where we start to see his defining psychological framework, I guess. Because instead of resting or seeking medical care, the records note he would simply take a thick piece of string, indifferently sew up the deep cuts on his own feet, and keep walking.
Just sew them up with string.
Okay, I have to pause and push back on this on behalf of our listener. Because to a modern ear, sewing your own feet up with string and refusing to stop walking doesn't just sound ascetic. It sounds like severe self-harm.
I completely understand why it sounds that way today.
Right, and it ties into the nickname he coined for himself, which is Brother Ass. Why would someone so inherently good be so relentlessly hard on himself?
Yeah, he leaned into that identity completely. He compared himself to a beast of burden. He openly called himself stubborn, lazy, and gluttonous, claiming he was only useful for carrying heavy loads.
There's that famous account where he's trying to navigate through a massive crowd pouring out of a church, right? People blocking the street, and he's carrying this back-breaking sack. And instead of asking politely, he shouts out, "Make way for the Capuchin's ass."
Yes.
And the crowd naturally starts looking around for a literal donkey, and he just points to himself. He was constantly deflecting any shred of dignity. Isn't that taking self-deprecation too far? Feels like terrible self-esteem.
Through a 21st century psychological lens, it certainly looks that way. We place a high premium on self-worth and self-care. But to understand Felix, we really have to look at 16th century spiritual mechanics.
Okay, what do you mean?
This wasn't about self-hatred. It was about the complete and utter annihilation of the ego. By claiming the absolute lowest possible status, like a farm animal, he made himself impervious to the two things that destroy leaders and movements, which are praise and humiliation.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. If you already consider yourself a donkey, an insult can't hurt you, and flattery can't corrupt you.
That is a really profound way to look at it. It's the ultimate defensive posture. You can't fall if you were already purposefully lying on the floor.
Exactly. And what makes this so critical is that his extreme radical humility wasn't just a quirky personal choice. It turned out to be the exact survival mechanism his entire religious order desperately needed at that specific moment in history.
Let's look at the broader context of what the Capuchins were facing right when Felix was walking those streets.
Yeah.
Because they were essentially staring down the barrel of institutional extinction.
They were in dire straits. The Capuchins were a relatively new reform movement. They had broken away from the broader Franciscan order because they wanted to return to a much stricter, purer interpretation of poverty and simplicity.
Right.
But in 1542, their top leader, the vicar general of the order, a man named Bernardino Aquino, did the unthinkable.
He defected.
He didn't just defect. Aquino was one of the most famous, highly educated, and spellbinding Catholic preachers in all of Europe. And right at the height of the Protestant Reformation, when religious tensions were at a boiling point and the Inquisition was ramping up,
Yeah, the worst possible time.
he fled over the Alps to Geneva and became a Protestant pastor.
That is catastrophic. That is the equivalent of a top-ranking military general defecting to a hostile superpower during the peak of the Cold War.
It really is.
The fallout must have been absolute panic.
Panic and intense suspicion. The Roman authorities immediately suspected the entire Capuchin order of harboring heresy. The Pope was furious.
Naturally.
There are high-level, serious discussions happening at the Vatican about completely suppressing the Capuchins, like just dissolving the order, scattering the men, and wiping them off the map. Public trust in them plummeted overnight.
And right into the middle of this massive PR nightmare walks Felix, a guy with a burlap sack, bleeding feet, and a total lack of theological sophistication.
Yes. The brilliant, highly educated leader had just betrayed the church due to what was viewed as intellectual pride. And the universe responds by sending Rome a man who calls himself a donkey.
So could we say Felix was essentially the ultimate PR campaign? Not because he was spinning a clever narrative, but precisely because he possessed zero pretense.
That is exactly what happened. He didn't write pamphlets defending the Capuchins. He didn't debate theology in the public squares. The sources say he just walked the streets every single day with his eyes on the ground, rosary in hand, mind in heaven.
Radiating an undeniable lived authenticity. He constantly greeted everyone he met with a joyful Deo Gratias.
Thanks be to God, yes. And because of that, he earned the nickname Brother Deo Gratias. He became the physical counter-argument to this scandal.
Because you can't argue that an entire organization is secretly plotting complex heresies when their most visible public face is a guy who cheerfully sews his own feet up so he can bring bread to the poor.
He acted as a firewall. The people of Rome looked at Felix and realized that whatever theological debates were happening in the Vatican, the lived reality of this Capuchin friar was profoundly good. His undeniable goodness restored public trust.
The trust he built was staggering. I mean, the sources mention that by 1580, Rome was hit with a devastating famine. And the political leaders of the city didn't go to the wealthy merchants or the nobility to solve the logistics.
They didn't.
They went to the Capuchins and essentially asked to borrow Felix. They put this illiterate farmhand in charge of managing the food logistics for the starving city.
It's incredible. And his influence was so culturally massive that by 1650, the records show 277 Capuchin friars in Italy had taken the name Felix.
Wow. He became the living archetype of what the order was supposed to be. And, you know, this brings me back to that Cloudflare security firewall I mentioned in the intro.
Right, the blocked link.
Yeah. It is such a brilliant modern irony. We tried to open a web page for the sanctuary of San Felice al Acqua, and our browser blocked it because of an algorithmic security check. It's incredibly fitting for a saint who lived a life completely disconnected from complex systems.
It really is perfect.
We are trying to use a hyper-complex digital system to understand a man whose entire historical superpower was that he bypassed all of that, which is actually a perfect transition to the Catholic Encyclopedia source you provided for us.
Yes, because that source details the massive intellectual output of the early church giants. We are talking about the fathers of the church, men like St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose.
The heavy hitters.
They're absolute heavy hitters. These men defended Christianity through incredibly complex philosophy, vast literary works, and deep theological arguments against heresies. Augustine's writings fundamentally shaped Western civilization.
And Jerome translated the vast library of scripture into the Latin Vulgate. They were writing multi-volume treatises.
Exactly. You have this towering intellectualism on one hand, and then you have Felix. When people would ask him about his education, he would openly admit he wasn't learned. He joked that he only knew 6 letters.
5 red and 1 white. Right?
Yes. 5 red representing the wounds of Christ, and 1 white representing the Virgin Mary. He stripped away all the intellectual scaffolding until nothing was left but the core emotion and sacrifice.
And there's that amazing encounter in the source material he had with a wealthy lawyer. Felix is making his rounds, begging, and he stops at the lawyer's home. He notices this massive, beautifully bound collection of books, volumes of law and philosophy.
A well-stocked bookcase.
And hanging right above this imposing bookcase is a simple wooden crucifix. Felix points to the crucifix and tells the lawyer, "Whoever does not understand this book does not know what books are."
It is a stunningly subversive statement. This illiterate beggar looks at a man who has dedicated his entire life to elite academic study and gently tells him that all human knowledge is secondary to that one simple reality.
Wait, listening to this, I'm thinking of another analogy. It feels almost like a software dynamic.
Okay, how so?
Like, if the Church Fathers, the Augustines, and the Jeromes are the ones writing the massive, highly complex source code of the Church, right? The operating system manuals that make the whole thing run, then St. Felix was the incredibly user-friendly app.
Oh, I like that.
He's the app that anyone on the street, regardless of their education or background, can immediately understand and interact with. You need the source code, obviously, but the average person can't read it. They need the interface.
That is a highly accurate way to view it. And what is vital to remember is that being this accessible, down-to-earth interface didn't make Felix a solemn, unapproachable figure. The sources make a point to highlight how deeply human he was.
He wasn't just a suffering ascetic walking around with a permanent scowl.
Not at all. He had normal struggles, joys, and a great sense of humor. His dynamic with St. Philip Neri is legendary.
Philip Neri was, he was an incredibly influential priest, right?
Yes, known as the Apostle of Rome. He was also a living saint and had his own joyful and slightly eccentric approach to faith. And because both of them were widely viewed by the public as these incredibly holy men, they had this shared problem.
The public wouldn't leave them alone.
Exactly. People were constantly treating them with this suffocating reverence, practically worshiping them, and they both recognized the danger in that. So they would actively strategize ways to embarrass themselves and hide their sanctity from the venerating public.
They would pull stunts. Like, the best account is when they deliberately arranged to meet in the middle of a crowded Roman street. Felix is carrying his wine flask, and right in front of the horrified, pious public, these two holy men tilt the flask back and take massive swigs of wine.
They were actively trying to look like a couple of day drinkers just to get the crowd to stop putting them on a pedestal.
It's amazing. And despite his lack of formal education, that kind of grounding made him a trusted counselor to the powerful. He actually predicted Pope Sixtus V's papacy, didn't he?
He did. He predicted that Cardinal Felix Peretti would become pope. And when it happened, Felix didn't bow and scrape. He bluntly warned the new pope, if you're going to be pope, really be pope, or you'd be better off staying a simple friar.
He just tells it like it is, no flattery at all.
And he lived that truth all the way to the end. He had a peaceful death on his 72nd birthday, May 18, 1587. The narrative that emerged around his passing involves a vision of the Virgin Mary handing him the infant Jesus.
Which is why he's almost always shown holding the Christ child in classic art, right?
Exactly. That became his standard iconography, and the historical accounts also claim a pretty remarkable post-mortem miracle. His feet, which had been brutalized and scarred by 40 years in the cobblestones, suddenly became smooth like a child's.
Wow. But I want to ask you, the listener, a question. Thinking about all this, is this why we actually relate to historical figures like Felix? Not because of the post-mortem miracles or the extreme fasting, but because he joked around with his friends.
Because he felt the same daily, exhausting demands tugging at his time that you and I do.
Exactly. And the most fascinating part is how the institution ultimately recognized him. Over a century later, in 1712, this illiterate man was officially canonized. And he was canonized in the exact same ceremony as Pope Pius V, a highly educated, powerful pontiff.
It really synthesizes the entire deep dive. St. Felix proves that profound impact and even historical immortality don't necessarily require high status, vast intellect, or complex strategies. Sometimes joyful service and relentless authenticity are enough.
So to you, the listener, the next time you feel completely overwhelmed by information overload or the pressure to be the smartest person in the room,
Which happens to all of us.
every day, you might want to channel a little bit of brother ass. Embrace the freedom of humility, do the unglamorous work sitting right in front of you, and just say, Deo Gratias.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to ponder.
Let's hear it.
Think back to the highly educated leader of the Capuchins, Bernardino Aquino. He fell from grace and almost destroyed the order through intellectual pride.
Right, the defector.
Yes. Did Felix's total lack of formal education actually protect him from that exact same pride, making his illiteracy not a weakness, but his single greatest spiritual asset?
Something to mull over the next time you were standing in that metaphorical server room.
Yes.
Thanks for exploring with us.